Yep, I think that's everyone we were expecting. If I just kick it off and I'll hand the rest over to you. Um,
Sure.
so, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for attending. Really appreciate it. Um, I know Michael's short on time. I'll just go through a few things quite quickly. Make sure that when you're during the process of the presentation, make sure that your microphones are all muted, and if you happen to forget, then I will mute you. And near the end, there'll be an opportunity for questions. So either turn on your cameras, your microphones, or put it in the chat, whatever's easiest. I'll hand the rest over to Michael.
Okay, thank you, Ali. Okay, so as Ali said, I had a personal thing that blew up yesterday, so I've got to finish this bang on too. So what I might do is cut out some of the presentation. And are you recording it, Ali, or not? You're
Yes,
welcome
I
to.
am recording it. No,
Right, okay. So you're welcome to do that, as I say. And if anybody ever wants any more questions afterwards or wants further clarity, they can do that. I mean, basically, my name is Michael Bibring. My dad was Harry Bibring. I don't know if any of you during your time at Watford had heard him present, because he used to present to Watford every year. And Mrs. Charlton asked me to do that last year, which was you know, it was difficult, but it was a real honour, because Dad died 2 years ago, and we kind of wanted to keep the thing going. And I've been doing that for many schools and other people, using some of his testimony and interspersing it with my own words. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about his life, his escape from Nazi-controlled Vienna, and basically run you through some slides and give you a feel for his life. It's effectively a flavour of his life, both before and after. I'm not very good at these things technically, so if I click the wrong way, apologies. So it's basically a teenager, he's a bit younger than you guys are now. But all this happened in his very formative years, when he was sort of early teens, 13, 14. And effectively, he, as you know, he used to speak in schools. He lived to the ripe age of 93 and was totally driven in telling the story, basically to try and prevent these things happening again. And obviously, we were all aware of things that, you know, the tragedies in Darfur and Bosnia and Cambodia. Syria, Rwanda, we can just go on and on. So it sort of makes you wonder whether whatever one does, one will ever go to eliminate these things. But ultimately, his purpose, and that's really the purpose of me continuing the talks, is to try and educate as much as possible, on the basis that if people are educated to understand the differences between people, instead of using them for prejudice and hate, they'll celebrate the difference. It's fabulous that we are all different and not all robots are one and identical. And my dad, those of you that did know him, he was an incredible, vibrant man. I mean, just in the week before he died, he spoke to, he was 93, and he spoke to 150 people, children in Ireland. He spoke at Bangor Castle in Ireland. He spoke to 200 MPs and civil servants. He went to the theatre. He played bridge. He appeared on Radio 2, and he was on Sky News. Remarkable, really. I mean, that's a 93-year-old man. And he literally came back from Ireland and passed away. So let me go through a little bit of his life. And this is. Sorry, can you hear that noise, by the way? Good. Okay. Can you hear me talking over it or not? Okay, so the point of really showing that, going back in time, is that's, you know, archive footage of what was going on in Germany and Austria, and I think the thing to keep at the back of your minds right the way through this, and forgive me if you know some of the history, and by all means I can gloss over things, but ultimately the most important thing I think to remember is that this policy to wipe out the Jews in Europe was a policy of an elected government. It wasn't a coup. The people of Germany, who were on their knees after the First World War, and Germany was in a terrible economic position, but they voted the Nazis in, and the Nazis then began the systematic anti-Semitic policies that manifested themselves in the horrendous concentration camps during the war. But that all started in 1935, way before the war. And you can see from some of this footage, I won't bother showing because we are short on time, I won't show you the whole of that video, but by and large it shows that the Nazis were very popular with the masses and people of your age and people younger. They had made the point that they would make economic prosperity come back to a country that was on its knees, and there was just unbridled joy for the Führer who was going to do that. And I think in some ways, if one is terribly objective, you can sort of understand that people who have suffered financially are going to just turn the other cheek unless they've got some real moral fiber that perhaps a lot of people, most of us, I suspect, probably don't have if it's stretched to the limit. If these people can be made, have their lives made better, and there's a scapegoat for that, well, we'll just ignore it. And I think that's one of the most important things that my dad used to say all the way through. If you educate people that actually that's wrong, then you'd like to think that when you're presented with that position, you're more likely to say, hold on a moment, that doesn't sound right. We can't just wipe out those people just to make our own lives better. The more education you've got, the less likely there is to be prejudice. And Dad used to say two things. One, there's only one race. It's the human race. There's no other race. And actually, what's interesting is that we're all a product of our surroundings. When we're all born, and there's one child born just over every 4 seconds in the world, there's no inbuilt wired prejudice. You pick that up from your parents, your friends, and circumstances in which you live. So I think that's something to remember for right the way through this. And a lot of my dad's talking in this is the testimony he gave to the Shoah Foundation, which was set up by Steven Spielberg, as you probably know. Obviously made great movies, Jaws and E.T., and he also filmed my father. So I'm not sure it gets as much commercial recognition, but he gives a lot of his. I wanted to use some of his words to show you some of the stuff. He was born in 1925, Polish parents, Leah and Michael. The tradition in the Jewish religion is that you try and keep an ancestor's name if they're no longer alive, and it's actually completely opposite to a lot of people, where some people will name their children after their own name even if they're there. But in the Jewish religion, it tends to be a tradition to name your a son or daughter after a departed relative, and I share my dad's name. My dad grew up with his sister Gertie, who was 2 years older than him, and they basically had a perfectly normal life. They basically, that's a photo there of Michael and Leah, my grandparents, and that's my father, very small in the bottom there, and his elder sister. So what I wanted to do is to play a little bit for you of what my dad was saying before this all kicked off. Let's hear it from him. Potentially.
I remember my flat. I remember the rooms. We lived in a block of flats in the 6th district of Vienna, which was not the center of Judaism in Vienna. That was the 2nd district. We lived in the 6th district on an arterial road leading out of Vienna called the Maria-Hilfer-Straße. And this block of flats had 3 buildings. We lived in the last building, the 3rd building, and we lived on the 2nd floor, if you don't count the mezzanine and things like that. There was no lift. And we had a flat which consisted of an entrance hall, a kitchen with a side room afterwards. We had a maid, and the maid slept in a room by the side of the kitchen. And then leading off the entrance hall in another direction, there were 3 rooms in line. There was my sister and my bedroom. There was a dining room cum lounge, and my parents' bedroom. So it was a 3-room flat.
Normal family life. He passed the entrance exams for a school very similar to Watford Grammar. He got into the gymnasium, which I think surprised his parents enormously, because he wasn't a terribly hard worker. But he did that. I think he used to tell us that he was determined to get into that school because it put back the day he had to leave school and go to work. And in those days, you had to do that when you were much earlier. You weren't, sort of benefiting as we all have been over the last X number of years of being able to continue education, into our 20s. They weren't a particularly Jewish religious family. My grandfather's shop was in a non-Jewish area. He sold ready-made clothing, and they used to go to synagogue on Saturdays, but primarily, as my dad used to tell us, it was for commercial benefit. They used to have their synagogue stamp to show they'd been, and they became quite a good currency for bartering. That if you'd been there, you could swap that with someone who hadn't and get something back for it. So that was kind of his reason to go. School was mornings only. I know at the moment you're not going to school at all, but I suspect that most people would be delighted to know they can only go to school in the morning, even if they're starting at 8, but they're finishing at 1. And his passion in the afternoon was skating. So I'm going to show you a little bit about that, and you can.
They are the reigning world champions, the reigning European champions, and their national champions.
I won't show you any more of that. He wasn't in that video, but he loved to skate. I found that quite amazing. That the videos you see of my father are taken from that Spielberg Foundation stuff, which is 20 odd years ago. So he looked much younger than you will have seen him if you were in your year 8 or 9 or whenever when he would have spoken. But still, it would be, if you've met him or seen him, you'd find it quite amazing that he was potential skater, because he wasn't a sporting man, but he loved to skate, and basically he will tell you about it now, I think.
I was a dedicated skater. I loved to skate, and I used to spend in the winter from September to March, September to April maybe, practically every spare minute at the skating rink. I didn't do any figure skating or anything like that. I just loved to go speed skating. I always wanted to learn how to play ice hockey, but my father regarded this as a very dangerous sport, and my father was a very protective man, and he forbade me to learn how to play ice hockey. So of course I consequently immediately did, without him knowing. And on my first lesson I got injured, and I had a hell of a job trying to explain the injury to my father. Eventually, of course, he found out exactly how it happened, and that was the end of my ice hockey career. My sister also skated. She was a figure skater, and she was quite good at it, so we went together. But being 2 years older and a girl, she had more advanced interests than I had. I mean, she had boyfriends at the age of 13 and 14, at which time I was 14. Yes, that's right. About age, I was about 12. I mean, I was just a nuisance of the little kid brother, and we used to go to the park, and she used to meet her friends, and I remember very much trying to interfere with their pleasures in the park at times. I have to say, I don't know which time I should say that, but I have to admit to having been not the best of behaved children, and that was pretty well known to anybody who knew us, that where Harry Bibring was, you kept out the way.
Okay, so very angelic photo of my father. But one of the things that he always talked about, and I think really bugged him, was he was a pain in the neck to his parents. That's why it was a miracle that he got into a gymnasium at 11 to be able to continue his education. But it always upset him and bugged him that he was never really able to show his parents what became of him. This still of the 1936 Olympics that was held in Berlin, and the black athlete there, Jesse Owens, who I think won 5 gold medals, refused to do the Nazi salute. and created an absolute furore at the time, because the whole thing of the Berlin Olympics was to showcase the Nazis. They were in power. The Nuremberg laws had been passed, but Jesse Owens did what I'd like you to do and think about doing. He stood up to it. He wasn't prepared just to put the Nazi salute out, because actually he didn't believe in it. And actually, as a sort of side product to that, if any of you are interested in football, I'm a Spurs fan, as was my dad. In 1935, England played at Tottenham's ground, and Tottenham was known as a Jewish club, but there's a swastika flying from the East Stand because England were playing Germany. And at that time, the English were very much of a mindset to try and be conciliatory with what was going on in Germany. Something to bear in mind, I think, that, let's stand up to prejudice, not just kowtow to whoever says yes, you've got to do this, that, and the other, because that's our rules. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my dad's dreams and ambitions, and remembering, of course, that he was 13 at the time, so these things were beginning to sort of become clearer in his mind and his parents, but not desperately yet.
Oh, the world owed me a living. As long as I could skate, there was really no problem. No, I had no ambitions. I was always interested in things mechanical. My father was a man who couldn't put a screw in a wall, and whenever anything went wrong in the house, my mother's brother, who lived quite close, he used to be called in to mend a fuse or to hang a picture on the wall or something of that kind. And I was always with him. I was always interested in see what he was doing and ask questions. So I must have had a mechanical gene somewhere that eventually came to the fore. But that was my only interest. Apart from that, as I say, my life centered around skating. As long as I could skate, I was happy.
So, normal kid, wasn't particularly interested in school, just wanted to do what he wanted to do, and by and large, they lived a perfectly normal life. As I said, my grandfather's shop was not in a particularly Jewish area, and when he was forced to put a yellow star on and say he was Jewish, all his customers were astonished, because my dad used to tell a story that they were basically surprised to the extent that one of them said, well, you can't be Jewish, you've never swindled anyone, which again gives you an indication of perhaps what people thought at the time, and people just glossed over that. But anti-Semitism was beginning to rear its head, and you can see some religious people here being made to scrub the streets in Vienna, being looked over and beaten quite often by the Nazi guards who were standing there. This is the Chancellor of Vienna, of Austria, before Hitler annexed Austria. His name was Dollfuss. So let's just hear a little bit about that anti-Semitism from my dad.
It was always there in schools and in newspapers. Austria had quite a fascist government under Dollfuss anyway, and one picked up the fact that we were different and not expected to be part of the general scene, even as a child. So certainly there was anti-Semitism in the wind, if you like, even before Hitler came. But we took no notice of it. It's just one of those things. Well, I never suffered from it, but I stuck with my Jewish friends, and we occasionally got called names or things like that, but we regarded that as normal and didn't feel that was a big problem.
I think it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at how he talks about that and actually try and reflect that into current UK the position of the UK, it's not anything like as bad as that, but there is sometimes just an underlying anti-Semitism, anti-black, anti-Muslim, anti-this, that, and the other, which you can feel sometimes when you're just having ordinary conversations with people. You probably are, I mean, I'm sure you've come across it in your time. I think you're lucky and privileged to be at a really, really good school that understands ethnic differences and is full of educated people. But I think it is there. Anyway, let's talk about the annexation, which, if you know anybody, happened in March 1938 when Hitler effectively annexed Austria as part of Greater Germany. And there you can see, not exactly being, it wasn't exactly forcing his way in. It was very much wanted by the people.
I was 12 years old. I was born in December, and Hitler came to Vienna in March 1938. So I was just 12 and a quarter years old. And I questioned what this was all about from my parents. My father was a tremendous optimist. He really regarded the occupation of Germany, by Germany of Austria, as something that will pass. It's a change of government, and in a few years' time there'll be a different government, and it'll be all separated again. It'll all go away. And initially, as I recall it, the experiences that we felt as Jews in the beginning of, from March 38 onwards, were major inconveniences rather than anything else, unless you were a known individual. For example, Hitler came to Vienna in March 1938, and in April 1938, my uncle, my mother's sister's husband, was arrested with the whole of his family, and they were put into an ordinary jail. They weren't taken to a concentration camp. They were put into a jail with a lot of other Jews at the time because they had something on him. I really don't know what. My father was quite the opposite. He had his shop in a very non-Jewish district of Vienna, and consequently all his customers, practically all his customers, were non-Jewish. And he, as a consequence, had a lot of contacts where he tried to get the release of my uncle, my aunt, and my two cousins from this, and he achieved that within about 4 weeks. Whereas he himself was regarded by all these non-Jews as quite a nice guy. He had his shop in there, he was well known in the district, and in fact, when he was first required to put a notice in his window that this is a Jewish shop, people rushed in and said, "Who stuck that in your window? Because you're not Jewish. You can't be. You've never swindled anybody, and you've never done this and that." And of course, my father explained, "Yes, I'm very much Jewish," and he had to keep the notice up. And they wouldn't believe that this was a Jewish shop initially. They soon believed it afterwards, but they didn't believe it initially. So he had, and he did get the release of them, as I say, within a month. With the exception of the elder of my two cousins, who, as I was told a story, on the day of release was required to carry a safe in the prison with he was an amateur boxer, a good few years older than me. At that time he was probably about 21, and somewhere around about maybe 20, 21, and he was an amateur boxer and very strong and big-built man, and he was required to carry a safe down 2 floors on the day of his release with another guy, and he scraped the wall in carrying the safe down. And the story, as I was told, he just was kicked by the prison guard, told him to be more careful and not scrape the wall, whereupon he put the safe down. And being an amateur boxer, he just socked him into the face, and consequently was sent to Dachau instead of being released.
So again, just pausing there for a minute, quite an extraordinary concept that you hit a prison guard and go to a concentration camp. And again, that's where my dad refers to people thinking that he can't be Jewish because he hasn't swindled anybody. So I think if you just take it as anti-Semitism beginning to rear its head between 35 and 38. 38, Germany annexes Austria and it becomes part of Germany. And then in November 1938 was Kristallnacht, which is the night of broken glass, which you may have heard of, and that I think that was the next stage of things becoming completely intolerable for the Jews. So let's hear from my dad on that.
I Well, that is really when life changed dramatically for us. As I said, up until that time, my father really believed that Hitler and the Hitler regime would go away eventually and we would go back to a normal life. On the 9th of November, I presume everybody knows the cause of Kristallnacht, the assassination of the German diplomat in France. We heard that on the news on the 9th of November and raised a couple of eyebrows and wondered what the effect might be. During the night, being children, we slept pretty well, but we did hear lots of crackling and noise, and one of the noises we afterwards heard was that synagogue in the Schmalzhofgasse that I mentioned burning, but we didn't realize that, what we were hearing during the night, because we weren't that close that we could see. Now, in the morning, my father's shop opened at 8 o'clock, and as was normal, he would leave home around about 7:30 to open the shop. And round about probably about 8:30, 9 o'clock, something like that, my mother got a telephone call from the staff from the shop asking what happened to my father because he never arrived to open the shop. That caused tremendous concern, and what actually happened, we found out afterwards, that he was actually arrested leaving the block of flats in which we lived and taken away to a local Viennese prison. We didn't know about this till much later, but my mother was getting quite concerned, sort of trying to phone various people and asking what happened. And from the telephone calls that she made, she found that a lot of other men had suddenly disappeared. So we knew something was up, and we assumed that he must have been picked up somewhere. We didn't know where.
You can't imagine what people may have thought here, because you go to bed in a normal fashion, subject to the anti-Semitism that was around, and then everything dear to you, all the Jewish shops, the Jewish synagogues, and Jewish anything Jewish had been ransacked. And my grandfather was basically arrested when he went. He, instead of going to work, he was arrested when he came out of his house the day after Kristallnacht, and my dad, his sister, and their mum, together with lots of other women and children, were rounded up and taken and effectively put under house arrest. And there were about 50 people in a flat, I'm told a 4-bedroom flat, where the Nazis just commandeered this flat and said, right, you're now looking after these 50 people. And obviously you can imagine 40, 50 people in a 4-bedroom flat doesn't work, particularly where they're not expecting you. And in those days, they didn't have big chest freezers full of food, so there wasn't food to go around anyway. But they were told, they were told to leave the flat that they lived in. It was sealed, don't come back. And they were told not to go out of the flat, and effect the flat where they were held as in house arrest. And that went on for a week. They did manage to get food, because my aunt, who was quite small and didn't look terribly Jewish, basically persuaded the adults that she could sneak out and go to the shops and bring stuff back without being seen. And that was terribly dangerous, but she did that. And then at the end of that week, in just a similar fashion as they were taken away, they were released. The Nazis could come every day to check on them, said, okay, you can go now. And that was something which I don't think anybody understood why. The whole, looking back now, historically, people think that the Nazis had planned something, because this Kristallnacht destruction took place all over Germany and Austria. And it looks like they were ready to do, but weren't ready to do something to effect the next stage. So they let everybody go. And as my grandmother and my dad and sister and his sister were coming out of that flat, they saw my grandfather coming in the other direction, somewhere between where they were and the flat. And he'd been let out of jail. His head had been shaved into a swastika, and he'd been let out. And I think that it was a terribly distressing time by all accounts for everybody. my grandfather's massive optimistic state and nature, I think, was tested to its limit, because I think by then he thought this is crazy. He'd been arrested for no reason. He'd been let go for no reason, and it was a very random thing. Apparently, whether it's 1 in 10, I don't know, but 9 out of 10 people were released, and 1 in 10 was sent to a concentration camp. And I'm told, but my dad told me at the time, it was literally go that way. Very similar in a way to some of the selection processes that you might have read about in the concentration camps that came in the early 40s. It's difficult to imagine what people could possibly have thought. But I think the one thing that is crystal clear is this was the end of the optimism that my grandfather in particular had. And they decided they needed to go and get out. And I think that I think it's important again to understand the context of all this. And when I do school talks, or when I was doing school talks in the year before, after my dad died and before the lockdown, I would say to the group, and the last time I went to Watford Grammar in particular, I said, when did any of you last go on holiday or get on a plane? And I said, in the last 3 months, have you been on holiday? And it was within 3 months of Christmas. And I swear to you, 95% hands went up. Well, my grandfather and grandmother's holiday used to be 20 miles north of Vienna, for a couple of weeks by a lake, for 10 days a year. And as most families were in those days, they didn't have 6 weeks holiday and da-da-da-da-da. The EasyJet hadn't yet reared its head. They didn't have a passport. They'd never been out of Austria. So the concept of, I can't live here anymore because it's too dangerous, and this is my life, and it has been perfectly normal forever, and I have to get out, is I don't think it's easy to kind of put that into a context that we can understand, particularly as my dad was 13. So this was his identity card, and what they then did is they had to start planning how they were going to get out and find his way out of Austria.
Well, it was an emotional day, as you might imagine. I remember.
Sorry, I should just caveat that because I haven't shown the previous video. Because they had no passports and they had no visa, and basically, as is the case now with the Syrian refugees, one after the other countries started to close their borders and say, no, it's not my problem, send them somewhere else. And that sadly is what the world has done historically forever. The only place you could go was Shanghai, where Dr. Ho, who was the foreign minister, I think, had said that he would allow a quota in without, if they were Jews and they were persecuted, even if they didn't have passports or visas. And the plan was for my grandfather to take the family to Shanghai. Something happened, which we're not quite sure of. Either they stopped that quota, or what my dad believed when he first came over to the UK was that my grandfather had been robbed on the way to buy the tickets to go to Shanghai. And therefore there was no potential way out any longer, except for the kinder transport. I mean, you're aware of what the kinder transport is in broad terms? I think it was a British initiative to basically, where they'd agreed with the Nazis that children could go, provided to the UK, provided they didn't take their parents with them, and they had someone in the UK to guarantee them. My grandfather had a dodgy heart, and in about 33, 34, 35, I'm not sure exactly when, had been in a hospital and had seen somebody who'd been retained in that hospital who actually was perfectly okay, but they were paying huge amounts of money to stay there. And my grandfather wrote to their relatives in the UK and said, I think your relative has been being taken advantage of. You're paying a load of money, perfectly all right. And they got him out of the hospital. Between November 1938 and March 1939, when my dad got on the kinder transport train, and bearing in mind communication, terribly difficult at that time. But in those 4 months, my grandfather had managed to get hold of the people in England and said, you might remember I helped you out 4 or 5 years ago. I'm desperate now for someone to stand guarantor in the UK for my son and my daughter, who I'm going to send on this kinder transport. And they agreed to do that. So that's how my dad managed to get out of Vienna. But I think putting that into context, he left on the 13th of March 1939. It's exactly 1 year to the day following the Anschluss. So, you know, within 12 months, and I know 12 months can seem a long time in a concept of lockdown, and it's nearly 12 months since we started all this nonsense. But in 12 months, their family had been split up, and their life had been completely intolerable. So let's hear a little bit about how my dad left Vienna.
Well, it was an emotional day, as you might imagine. I remember very clearly I was all standing on the platform at the train with hundreds of other children, lots of other parents. Everybody was crying, and my parents assured us that it won't be for long. And much as I gave grief to my parents, I really didn't want to leave them. But there you are, 13 years of age. My sister said she'd look after me. She was a great age of 15. So I just remembered a very dark evening and going on a train and a lot of tears, as one might imagine, of people saying goodbye to their children, because the whole train was full of children.
As I say, quite amazing. About 2 or 3 years ago, I said at the beginning of this video, I'd done a bike ride from Amsterdam to Berlin for the Anne Frank Trust. I did a bike ride 2018 with my son from Berlin to Liverpool Street Station to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the first kinder transport, and that was 600 miles going north, which was a tough old ride, but at least it was a bit warmer than the one to Berlin. But it was quite an emotional thing for us, because we did it together. And as we crossed from from Germany into Holland on that border, I couldn't help thinking what my dad often used to say, that was the first time they'd seen friendly faces for years, people putting sweets and toys through the window, etc. And at the end of that bike ride, just to complete the story, we persuaded my father, who was 92 at the time, to join my son and I for the last mile. So we organised a tandem tricycle. I didn't want to take the risk of falling off the tandem with him, so we had a tandem tricycle which did the last mile, in which he told me at least 5 times I wasn't cycling right or whatever. But it was quite interesting. It was very emotional coming into Liverpool Street Station. This is a bit of video here. My dad used to do these talks, as you know. This was one which he did where there was a live webcast. So this is only 3 years ago. So more of the man that physically that you will have seen, just talking a little bit about his leaving.
Okay. So can you tell us something about the journey to
the journey? Well, the journey was largely uneventful, actually. It was a steam train. The time it took from leaving Vienna at 10 o'clock on the 13th of March 1938 to reach Holland, the borders of Germany with Holland, was nearly 24 hours. And when it got there, during that journey, we were confined to compartments. It's not many of you young people will have had the pleasure of sitting in a compartmental railway carriage. They used to exist, but you might have seen them in museums or old films, where there's a long gangway the whole of the carriage, and from that gangway are separate compartments taking about 6 people in each compartment. So we were sitting there with strange children. There was a guard walking up the corridor constantly. We were not allowed to come out except for going to the toilet, and when we were going to the toilet, they took us to the toilet, stood outside the toilet, brought us back again. The only food we had, of course, was what we brought with us in our cases.
Okay, so again, gives you a feel for that journey. And just a funny anecdote about the webcast. that was a talk he gave a year before he died, and it was on a webcast. I think something like 7,000 or 8,000 kids watched it on the screen. And an anecdote of that is about 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, my father was invited as a guest of honor to a private showing just for children of a play called The Pianist of Willesden Lane, which, if you're interested in my dad's story, watch it. It's fantastic. It's exactly my dad's story. Instead of skating, it's someone who plays the piano. But this was a private production. And as we walked in, all the children were going, hello, hello, hello. And I thought they were all sort of 12, 13, 14. And I thought, this is amazing. I've never seen such polite people to an elderly man. What I hadn't realized, that they'd invited all of the people who'd watched Dad on the webcast. And there were 5 showings of this. So when word got round and we were sitting in the front row where he was there, Harry Bibring's here, he suddenly, if you have met him, you kind of get this. He got up on the stage and just sort of waving to everybody. And it was, when he died, the Holocaust Educational Trust described him in the obituary as half saint, half rock star. And that, I think, is where he got that from. It was a phenomenal moment. And he then went to all of 5 of those showings and had the same experience with everybody. So he then got to London, totally different, spoke no English whatsoever. He was supposed to have learnt English in English lessons instead of his bar mitzvah lessons in 1938, because his bar mitzvah was cancelled. But he was thrown out of the English lessons on the first one for talking, so he never learnt any English. Probably did him some favors in the long run, because when he did learn it in England from an English schoolmaster, he ended up with almost no accent. And when he got here, he worked for this family who'd looked after him. And they didn't kind of put when they stood guarantor for him, but they weren't able to put him in their own house. So he was split up from my aunt from day one, and they used to see each other on occasional weekends until they were evacuated out of London during the Blitz in 1941. He worked for this guy as a tailor's runner. He had a number of menswear shops across London, and my dad used to be told to take sample materials from one shop to another because they didn't all have the same stock. He had ended up with an encyclopedic knowledge of the underground. He could tell you which trains went anywhere because he spent his whole life on it, but he hated it. He wanted to be an engineer. He basically spent 15, 16 years after he was about 18, 19, studying at night classes and everything else to become an engineer and subsequently a lecturer. Let me just talk a little bit about the communication with his parents, which I just again want to give you a flavour of this, because it's totally different to where we are today with all the things I don't understand in Instagram and Facebook and texting and everything else. Well, I do understand that, but totally different. Communication was by post, and there was no postal service between England and Germany, or England and Austria, because they were at war with one another. So let me just explain how this actually happened, or let my dad explain it.
You went to the Citizens Advice Bureau, and you were given a form of a Red Cross letter on which you were allowed to write 25 words. You wrote your 25 words, took it to the Red Cross, took it to the Citizens Advice Bureau. They in turn sent it to the Red Cross, who transmitted it to Geneva, and then Geneva sent it on to Vienna. And the system was that the recipient of these letters could write 25 words on the back of those letters. And we wrote quite a number of these letters, but you were only allowed to write, I think, one a month. So I was allowed to write one a month. My sister was allowed to write one a month. So we wrote fortnightly. And suddenly, so that went on from 41 to right through 42. But we started getting no letters coming back after June 1942. And we assumed then that my mother was arrested or somewhere in we knew about concentration camps by then.
Okay, I'll pause that there because it does seem to be completely out of sync. I mean, I just think it's quite it's quite interesting to put that in context. I mean, you write 25 words on effectively a postcard, and it's a 6-month round trip, and they could write one each, so every month they'd write two. But that's the only basis of how they could communicate, and when that communication stopped in 1942. My dad was 16 by then. He had to assume his parents were no longer alive. He didn't know. He found out actually through one of the letters, which the last one that you will have seen on that, basically in English says, "Dear mother, I hope you're healthy. We've received letters through this, and we sent a number. We haven't received all of the replies. I hope everything is well, and we're in contact with another family called the Gashkas." And the reply on the back was, and this is particularly heartrending, is, "Darling children, this is the 6th letter. I hope you've received them in good health. I'm okay. The Gashkas, that family, are okay. Don't forget your father's yacht site." And that was dated the 9th of June. And to put that in context, a yacht site is the Jewish anniversary of a death. And that's how my dad found out that my grandfather had died. He didn't know he died. He was just told not to forget the 12-month anniversary. As it turned out, just to give you some flavour of what happened to his parents, my grandfather, as I said earlier, had a dodgy heart, and he was rounded up by the Nazis, and basically had a heart attack in the van on the way to God knows where, and they threw him out. And he died on the street. And the good thing is he was spared he was spared the concentration camps, and he actually has a grave in Vienna. And I actually wear that's his signet ring, which has got his name on it. That was another byproduct story of how human beings can be wonderful when they want to be. There were some non-Jewish neighbours that kept lots of stuff on the basis that my dad might one day come back, and he took my mum, who he met in 1946. He took her back to where he'd been brought up, and they met them, and they said, "Oh, wonderful," and they gave them tablecloths and jewellery and bits and pieces. It was quite amazing. They just kept it on the off chance. But my grandfather died of a heart attack. My grandmother was murdered in Sobibor, which is one of the death camps in 1942. So she wasn't spared that. Anyway, it was pretty awful. So I said to you, he spent 14 years basically learning to become an engineer, and he qualified as an engineer, and in the end switched careers from being an engineer to a lecturer at Middlesex University. Met my mum, that's them at their wedding day, and then basically I was born, they got married in 47, I was born in 55 as an only child, because once you've got a child that's perfect, you don't want another one. No, I don't know whether that's the reason, I don't suppose so. It was, we had a very normal upbringing. My dad didn't really talk about his life in Vienna until much later. I was probably in my late 20s before we actually knew much of what had happened. But he was one of those people that was always very positive, looking forward. And I just, I didn't know my grandparents, and I knew that they died in the war, and that was that. I didn't know anything else. And in those days, perhaps it was slightly different, because I don't know what everybody's family situation is, but we're very close to our grandchildren, and most young children these days tend to have grandchildren around, because there hasn't been a war, and there hasn't been people live longer, etc. So but I didn't really think any different. But my dad lived a great life. I got married in 77, which to the daughter that he'd never had, and he loved her enormously. We've got 2 children who themselves got married, and we now have 5 grandchildren. So if you look on this as a positive for those people who stood guarantor back in 1939, have given rise to, it's about 25, 26 people if you count my late aunt and her 4 children and their grandchildren. This is just something just to finish this off. These you can see here, these things are called Stolpersteine, which are called stones of remembrance. And Germany in particular, if you go to Berlin, there's loads of these around, where the Germany was much quicker than Austria to acknowledge its problems and acknowledge what it had done wrong, allowed for these things to be cemented into the pavement outside where people were taken away during the war. Austria started to do that, and we campaigned for quite some time to have these put outside my grandparents' late flat, and that was done. It started when my dad was still around, but it didn't get finished until December 2019, when we went out for this ceremony here. You can see my son there, and you can see at the top pictures in the pavement, and that says Leah Esther, basically deported to Sobibor, murdered in the Holocaust. My father, Michael Bibring, it's always a bit incongruous to see my name in there, but died in Vienna, and then Goethe and Harry escaped on the Kindertransport to England on the 13th of March. And that was a very poignant day, particularly actually. It's probably 500 meters from the flat that they were in. And you can see it's a very busy street here. Probably 500 meters walk from there to the Westbahnhof station, where they left to go on the Kindertransport train. And when my wife and I, my kids are there as well, and we walked from there, having done this and planted this and dedicated this the stone. We walked from there to the station. I could not get out of my head what my dad and my sister, my aunt, and the parents who took them to the station must have been thinking in March 1938. It's a half a mile walk, half a kilometre walk. I can't get my head around it. But what was also lovely is you can see how many people are there. That is a product, and you actually are exactly this age. My dad talked 2 or 3 times, maybe 5 or 6 times actually, at his old school, where he was expelled actually after Hitler came. They expelled all the Jewish children. But he talked at that school maybe 3, 4, 5 times. And they got wind of so I'm in touch with the history teacher who retired, and she told the current history teacher that we were doing this. So she carted down a load of sick formers, people your age, who basically said, well, we want to be there. We'd heard him speak and we want to be there. So it was a beautiful blue sky, sunny day, and the street fell silent. There were about 40 or 50 17, 18-year-olds who'd heard my dad speak, and it was very powerful, very powerful. I'd taken some whiskey and they were very keen to say, oh yes, and the history teachers were saying, no, they're underage. So we had a bit of fun, but that's a permanent memorial. My dad was awarded the British Empire Medal for his talks to schools, and we went to Buckingham Palace, where that's the ceremony on the left, and that's, as you probably know, the Queen on the right. That's me at Buckingham Palace with some reflected glory, and that was him. And I think that kind of what I want to do is carry on doing what he does or did, telling the story primarily to people that don't know it, and primarily to people a little bit younger than you who I think can completely resonate with the fact that they're 13 and have everything they want in life, and he was 13 and that was totally different. And if you can get that message across and tell that story, we got a chance of these things not happening again. So Ali, that's all from me. Questions, happy to take any questions anybody wants to ask. There you go.
Thank you, Michael. Please raise your hand if you are going to ask a question, or put it in the chat. And I think we'll start with Arush.
Thanks, Ali. Thank you, Michael, for your talk. It was really, really interesting, amazing to hear from you. And you spoke about and introduced your father, Harry, as someone who had his life interrupted as a child by an awful regime. And we continue to see that around the world today, young children having their lives interrupted by the politics surrounding them. And Harry continued to stand up for what he believed in throughout his life, as he spoke about, despite the fact he might have faced restrictions and difficulties whilst doing so. So my question to you is, as young people today, how can we continue to stand up for what we believe in, defend those who are being discriminated against, despite the fact that we might face some difficulties and restrictions whilst doing so?
It's a really good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer, Irish. I think that it's very easy to say, and the theme of what I've said is stand up to prejudice and don't turn the other cheek. And I think as a concept, excuse me, that's an easy concept to get your head around. It becomes more and more difficult when the environment in which you live has been embroiled in partly prejudice and partly fear-driven prejudice, because I can imagine there probably were people who would think this is wrong, but actually if I put my head above the parapet here, I'm going to be in trouble and my children will be in trouble. So it's just easier to say nothing. It's not affecting me, and it's easier to say nothing. I think that at some stage there's a kind of justification for that, because if I tell you that if you know there's a Jew living next door to you and you don't report him, I'm going to shoot you, then it takes a very brave you to say, okay, I won't report that person. I mean, they're putting it in very simplistic terms, but by and large, if the whole environment in which we live is geared to understanding different cultures, you won't get to that position in the first place. And if my first reaction to somebody is they're black as opposed to their name is George, if my first reaction is to emphasize their difference, then I think you've got a much more difficult journey, and it's much easier to go to become prejudiced. We've heard, I mean, you've seen it all over the place in I think it was one of the football managers recently, or players, referred to the black guy as opposed to Trevor number 10. I can't remember the story, but if the concept is that you're in your uppermost mind that the differences are there, then I think prejudice is going to be there much more easily. But if your basic tenet is actually we're all human beings, we're all different, and that's fantastic. It's wonderful. I mean, wouldn't it be boring if we were all the same? If that's your basic, kind of approach to life, then I think that prejudice won't exist, and you will stand up to it, and you will have it'll be much easier, because most people would do that. I can't imagine there's any tolerance whatsoever in your school for bullying or prejudice. I can't imagine. I suspect it goes on, but I bet you there's no tolerance at the educators level, the teachers level, and that's big. And that must kind of, when I've come into Watford, and I've done it 3 or 4 times, you're surrounded by respect for one another. And if you've got that respect, and people are treated equally, and you've got different creeds and colours and so on and so forth, you're less likely to have the problem. It's about educating. Is that, I don't know if that answers your question, but
oh, it absolutely does. Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
I have a few sent in here as well, if you will allow, Michael. Is that right?
Yeah. Just before you do that, I mean, you're presumably all going to be off to university, next year or the year after, whenever you can. You'll see it all over the place in university, because you're dealing with you get 2 different. You're dealing with the how do I put it, the radicals, who are they're bright, but they're so intent on them being right that they stamp on things that are different. And you see, and there'll be societies for everything. There'll be the Jewish society, the Muslim society, the stamp collecting society. So you've got all of that, which raises the profile, but it also makes it easier for the people that want to be stamp on differences to do so. And I think that, I think you'll find when you get to uni, you'll see both sides of it really, really clearly. And hopefully you'll get to uni when you're actually physically allowed to go and you have to do this. Anyway, go on, sorry. Yes, Ali.
Yeah, I've got a quick question from Jacob. Why do you think that it's important to have talks like this and ones that your father gave, as well as learning the history through books and lessons?
I think, look, books, lessons, and good history teachers are like gold dust. I mean, they're wonderful. But I think if you can hear, and I'm obviously not doing that because I'm not a survivor, but if you can hear a story from someone who has actually witnessed an atrocity or a prejudice or whatever it is, you hear it firsthand physically. There really is no substitute for that. And I've been to many Anne Frank Trust lunches, which they do every January, February, where quite often they're looking at not just the Holocaust, but sort of Darfur and Syria, and they've had refugees from all shapes, sizes, colours, and everything else. And a lot of those, because they're much more recent, are people in their 50s and 60s talking about how their friends were taken away and tortured, and the friend on the other side of the street was no longer a friend, didn't speak to them anymore. And I think if you hear that physically firsthand from people, there ain't no substitute for that. Eventually, you can't do that because I'd love to hear about people who were victims of the Crusades, but that's a long time ago, and you can't. So you can only look at history books, and history as much. And I studied history for A-level, and I'm a big fan of learning from decent historians. But history is always written by the educated people who were there, and it's always slanted in some way, shape, or form. I mean, the great historians, A.J.P. Taylor and so on, will tell the story as it should be told in a constructive, objective fashion. But there's nothing like hearing from someone who's there, which is why when I do the talk, what I want to do is not just talk to you about what I'd heard from my dad, but I want to use a bit of his testimony. Some of it's a bit old now, but we've kind of tried to sort of jazz it up by using the videography that we put in. But there's nothing like hearing it from him.
Yeah. And I think that relates quite closely to our next question about keeping the history alive. He's asking, given we have so many lessons to learn from the Holocaust, are you optimistic about the future, given that our generation has had the opportunity to learn from the experiences? And he says that future generations won't have the opportunity to hear from survivors like we are fortunate to. So how do we keep the lessons learned alive?
Another really good question. I think I am optimistic because I've inherited a lot of my grandfather's optimism anyway, but I am optimistic because there's been really nothing was talked about between 1945 and 1970. That you just didn't hear much about it. The people who'd survived felt enormous guilt that they'd survived and 35 members of their family hadn't. So there was all that going on, and it only and the concepts of stress syndromes from war weren't really even known about in those days. So the people didn't. There was nothing going on. Then there was this huge influx of talks and people coming forward. And Steven Spielberg and his Shoah Foundation were an amazing organization to do that, because they just recorded thousands and thousands and thousands of testimonies from people who had survived. So because that all happened, and the mediums for recording it are now much more permanent. I'm not looking at an old black and white photo that will get dog-eared and won't be there in 10 years' time. I'm looking at stuff that will survive. It's going to stay on computers and it's there forever. And I think that will enable much more accurate history to be portrayed, and people to look back at real people who went through it. There's the Holocaust Museum in Beth Shalom, just outside Nottingham, which is, if you haven't been and you're interested in the subject, you should go. It's an amazing place. privately funded by some people who just went to Israel, learned about the Holocaust. They're not Jewish, and a guy called Stephen Smith, who now actually lives in the States and works for Steven Spielberg. But the museum is incredible. And they've started something which was funded, it cost a fortune to do it, where they basically did, it's not a hologram as such, but they basically have videoed a number of survivors, and they're still doing this, where they will ask that survivor 500 questions. Where were you born? What did you do? Da, 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 da. So when what they'll then do is have a virtual conversation with a school, where on the screen, Ali will put his hand up and say, okay, you were born in Vienna, what happened in 1938 when, and that person they'll plug in answer number 6, and that person hologram answers the question. And you're actually watching them do it. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. So I think with all of that, and with the amount that's been written and properly recorded, there's much more chance, in my view, and I am quite optimistic. There are lots of lunatics around who will still tell you that it didn't happen. There was a very, very famous libel case, which you may know about, was turned into a film called Denial, where a Holocaust denier was sued somebody who was saying that they were lying for damages, for defamation. It cost millions to defend, but I mean, this guy's sitting there saying it didn't happen, and there's like empirical evidence all over the place to show it did. So there'll always be those lunatics, but I am optimistic.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Praveen and James are asking as well. Praveen, if you'd like to ask the question to Michael directly.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for your talk today. I noticed you mentioned earlier about how people in difficult economic situations can often twitch their moral fibers. And with the onset of the pandemic, how do you think we could best tackle disinformation spread through these new, readily accessible forms of communication with social media and internet websites?
Another excellent question to which I don't really have an answer. I mean, if you look at, I don't know what your American politics are like, but if you look about how Trump managed his communication, truth became an irrelevance. It was everything but everything was designed to set out, and you can do that because you're dealing with unchecked media. So that's the downside of everything I've said. I mean, if the internet is used properly and all the forms of communication that we have are used properly, it's fantastic. But it's so easy to abuse because it's anonymous. I mean, I could send something out tomorrow on a false email address, or I can send out tweets and da-di-da without any comeback to me whatsoever, which is rubbish. And people latch onto it because I send it to 5 like-minded people, they send it to 5 other like-minded people, and suddenly there's there's several million followers. So that's the downside of that. And I think that kind of communication is so new that we haven't really established a way of controlling it, and I don't know if we can. The door's been opened now. I don't know, the concept of the internet when I was it didn't exist when I was your age, but as it came in, oh, this is wonderful, and I can press a button. I can learn anything if I press, just key in a few words. But you're also learning it from unchecked people. So if you put the wrong word in the wrong place, you can get a lot of disinformation. And I don't know how you'll ever control that, because the cat's been let out of the bag, and I don't know how you actually put it back. That's why I think, educating people, and I do think there's thousands and thousands of, maybe not thousands of thousands, but many, many thousands of Holocaust survivors who go round and tell their story, and have done for 10, 15 years. And a lot of those have been recorded to very impressionable 13 and 14-year-olds. And certainly if I looked, when my dad passed away, and I looked, we went through his flat, it took us 10 days to deal with the letters that he'd received from schools and the people he'd spoken to. I mean, tens of thousands of them. I'm talking tens of thousands of people. And that's just one person touching that, because he'd do 60 talks a year, 60, 100 people in the class, and so that's all good, but it's only just touching the sides. And that will become more and more difficult as time goes on. I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the spread of the internet, although as we've mentioned the advantages there, it just does a complete disservice to Harry's life, everything he went through, and many stories like that. And so, yeah, hearing it once again from you, Michael, after having heard it many years before, I don't think it took away anything from the experience of hearing it the first time. So thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
I wish all of you the best of luck, and with your careers and your next steps. You've got a good grounding. You're all bright people, and Watford Grammar's a great place. So you'll all do really well.
Thank you very much, Michael. All right.
Thanks for setting it up, Ali. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Take care.